So we just did our introduction, so check that box. And then this says broadband technology overview. What I was saying in a lot of the in-person meetings was that really we're not going to do a broadband 101 kind of introduction. I think a lot of you have a good sense of some of the technology or what you're using today for your broadband services, but we do want to level set a little bit on some terminology. We want to talk a little bit about the broadband technology in the context of these programs that we'll be talking about, and in the context of the feedback that we're hoping to hear from you all about your experiences as you go about your day-to-day business for your organizations. We'll talk about the funding and programmatic opportunities, a little bit of background about the community engagement that we've been doing and what we are hoping to gather from you all, and then the survey opportunity and some Q&A so we can take some notes and get some discussion going. All right. So we start with this slide in part because this is really, at the end of the day, the most important sort of element of the technology we want to talk about in the context of the upcoming funding opportunities. And that's these 3 different broadband speeds. Obviously, if you are subscribed to a broadband service, either for your business or your home, you know that broadband providers, or if you are a broadband provider, you know that you offer different types of speed tiers and pricing for your customers. You have a lot of services that you offer at a variety of different speeds, and that is an upload speed, a download speed, which is the speed at which data is pulled from the internet and provided to you as you're sitting at your desk in front of your computer. That's the download speed. And then the upload speed is the speed at which you are typing and you're buying shoes, or you're participating in a class, or you're sitting here on the Zoom call, the speed at which you are sending information to the internet. So that's a download and an upload speed. And those speeds are important. And these 3 speeds, this 25.3, 120, 100, 100, are particularly important for what we're going to be talking about today. So 25.3 megabits per second, 25 download, 3 megabits per second upload is a very base standard. And it is a very basic base standard because it is the FCC's definition of broadband today. It's slow. It's not a fast speed. It is a speed that probably many of us have surpassed, and if we can afford it and if it's offered to us, it is a speed that we've moved past in what we're purchasing from our broadband provider. But it is what the FCC considers to be broadband today. The FCC is trying to update it. They've been trying for the last few years, but through their processes, they're still at 25.3. So what that means and why that is important is because at 25.3 megabits per second, the FCC has determined that people are served by broadband if they have access to a service that is offering 25 megabits downstream and 3 megabits per second upstream. So as we look at maps, as we talk about funding, as we talk about basic standards, we need to keep in mind that if a community or an individual location does not have access to purchasing anything higher than 25.3 megabits per second, they are considered unserved, and anything over 25.3 is considered underserved. Now, what I mentioned earlier was that it's still a pretty slow speed. There's a lot of apps, there's a lot of activities online that we try to do today that are hard to do if you only have access to 25.3. So as the pandemic hit, as Congress started to pay a little bit more attention to what was happening and just happening, of course, now. The reliance that people had on broadband, Congress said, look, we're going to create a bunch of these programs. We're going to do a bunch of funding for broadband. We are going to create this 120 megabit per second standard. We are going to look at areas in the country that have access to no higher than 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload. And we're going to make that one of the standards. And what we're going to say for our funding requirements is that if an area has access to broadband that is no faster than 120, which means they've got 25.3 at between 25.3 and 120, we're going to call that underserved. So we think 120 is enough to do a lot of valuable things today, including work from home and learn from home, entertainment. So we think 120 is a good speed. We're going to call that, however, underserved. If you don't have 120, and that becomes important because we're going to allow federal funding to be spent in areas of a state or a community that is considered to be underserved, not just unserved. So this land between 25.3 and 120 becomes important, again, as we look at mapping and funding requirements. But now you see we also have 100, and that 100 megabit per second symmetrical, as it's called, becomes very important because many states, including Wyoming, are using that as a threshold for what an ISP or a partnership who receives investment money for a broadband infrastructure project from Wyoming. They have to say to Wyoming, we're going to use this funding to build infrastructure where we can offer our end users at least 100 megabit per second service. We may offer something that's slower, and people can buy something that's slower if they feel like that's what they need, but we need to make sure that our network can provide 100 megabit per second symmetrical service to all end users. So that's why these three criteria are important. That's why we look at these numbers very closely when we're doing analysis and we're doing mapping. So where do 25.3, 120, 100, where do these fit in on what people use today? We've done some analysis and we've looked and seen what people, what is the average for a family of 4, peak use, what kinds of bandwidth do they need to go primarily to this is like residential use, as you can see from the activities, telehealth, Netflix streaming, using other smart devices, just general internet surfing. What we found is total evening bandwidth use is out at a little less than 40 megabits download and a little less than 5 megabits upload. I've been saying when we were in person, I was generally suggesting that this is probably even a little low, depending on how tech savvy your household is, how many devices you may have in the household. It could even be, slightly higher than this. But as you can see, this is well below the 120 megabits per second. 1 second, Mike, let me just make one more point and then we'll have you weigh in. So this is what we're seeing the total bandwidth uses on average in the evening, right about there. This slide, however, makes a very important point, which is while the current bandwidth needs may be around that 40 download, 5 upload mark, what we believe is future bandwidth needs are going to well surpass that. As you can see, we're way out in the 450, 475 megabit per second download. That's not science fiction. That's not something that's 40 years from now. This is something that we believe sort of will move faster and faster and faster as more apps and more devices and more things become smarter. So it's an exponential growth in bandwidth need and bandwidth use. And as we plan investment in state and federal dollars in broadband infrastructure, we want to make sure that these networks can handle, eventually scale to the capacity to help households with their future bandwidth needs. So Mike Schober, go ahead. I see you have your hand up.
Just a quick question. And maybe you're going to get to this, but we've seen a lot of interest with crypto mining. Is that included in this slide deck, or how do you address that question?
Good question. I think it actually gives you a great example of a need of a use of bandwidth that no one even had heard of 5 years ago, probably even, or certainly 10 years ago, as people were contemplating infrastructure investment and infrastructure planning. I am not an expert in crypto mining. I'm kind of guessing that that this slide doesn't include sort of, if you will, higher bandwidth demand applications like that. This is pretty average use that we've seen across. So I'm sure there's other applications that we could think of that go beyond something like a crypto mining, but that, you know, that may demonstrate why we're out at 450 megabit per second download in the not too distant future. So hopefully that answers your question. So I think the short answer is probably not. I'm thinking the 40 download, 5 upload doesn't contemplate applications like that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sure, no problem. All right. Anybody else, either on the speed tiers or the bandwidth need? Happy to weigh in. We'll talk about this a little bit more too. Okay. Once in a while does this to me. Okay. Okay, here we go. So this is a little bit of background, right, about the you know, what we're looking at for the services that we're talking about. We're in that 120 to 100 symmetrical megabit per second service tier that we're looking at ISPs making sure that they can offer today, what customers need today, and what they may have today. And so we're going to take that information and we're going to put it on a broadband map. We're going to look at this mapping exercise to help us do our infrastructure and broadband planning with this federal and state, with this federal funding that we're talking about today. So if we were in person, I would say, you know, how many people have been on the broadband mapping, and, you know, feel free maybe to say yes in the chat, or that you have already done a lot of work with the broadband availability map. I know we have a fair number of ISPs on the call, and I'm sure they are actually quite familiar with this public Wyoming broadband availability map. So we will start there to say this is an exercise that the Business Council has undertaken to help them, to give them more data, more feedback, to help them with long-term broadband planning. And so what they did was they hired a consultant, they hired a contractor, Lightbox, as you could see from this, to give them a map with all locations, just locations that can be offered or are currently offered or are currently served by broadband. So they got a map from Lightbox that said, here are all the locations in the state of Wyoming that could or are currently served with broadband. They created this map. They took all the locations. They did some crunching. They created a map. And then they said, okay, ISPs, in November of last year, they said, okay, ISPs, now I need all the ISPs in the state to provide us with data about where your customers are, what technology you are using to serve your customers, what speed levels. Give us information about where you are serving in the state. And ISPs had a certain amount of time to provide all of that data to the Wyoming Business Council. They took that information, they did their number crunching, they put everything together, and they created the Wyoming Broadband Availability Map. They issued that map a few months ago. There was what built into this process was a challenge process, so that other ISPs could go on and say, well, no, you didn't quite get this right, or no, I serve there, or I don't serve there, or we don't think that area is served. They took all that challenge feedback data, and they're, you know, in the process of crunching all those numbers, and they now have a Wyoming broadband availability map where you can see whether your location, you could go on there, you could put in your address, and you can see whether your location is served, unserved, or underserved in a not just your address, but in a slightly more larger geographic area. The data was collected directly from Wyoming ISPs, and you can see the link here to the Wyoming Broadband Availability Map. Now, why is that important? Because not only does it give the public more information and more data about what's happening in Wyoming for broadband availability, and it gives the council some data to help for planning, it also helps ISPs decide what kinds of projects and the size of the project, the location of the projects they may want to create to request funding from the Wyoming Business Council. So the Wyoming Broadband Grant and Application Tool is a a function of the broadband availability map. If you are an ISP that provided data for this map and an ISP that is interested in applying for funding, and we'll talk about the first program that will come online, you can get access to the grant application tool in order to design your grant request, your proposed funding service area for your application. The expectation is that you will use this map. So everybody's on the same page, everybody's using the same map to create your proposed service area. So that's why those two things work together. So that's the state map. At the same time, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was creating its own national broadband map. Now, they went through a process that was very similar to what I just described the Wyoming Business Council went through. They hired a contractor, different contractor than Wyoming. They hired a contractor, say, give us a map with all of the locations across the country that could be served with broadband. The FCC called those broadband serviceable locations. And then last summer, they asked all ISPs across the country, including I'm sure the ones that are on this call, to provide the FCC data with where they serve, what technology they use, what speeds they're offering in those areas. And they took all that data and they crunched all the numbers. And in November of last year, they released a version of the national broadband map. Like Wyoming, they went through a challenge process. From about November up until just a few weeks ago, there was a challenge process of that map. And just about 3 weeks ago now, they released a version of the map that is essentially the next formal version of the national broadband map. The challenge, the map was controversial, a tricky thing to do nationally on a national scale. Difficult to corral all of the different ISPs and how they reported data and what kinds of, delineations they used. And so the challenge process was quite extensive. And what the FCC found was, especially for rural areas like Wyoming, like Alaska, particularly, there was some statistic that after the challenge process, Alaska ended up with a lot more broadband serviceable locations than what the FCC originally thought. So this was a challenge not only of what the ISP data provided, but a challenge of whether there was even, they missed some locations, like were there potential locations that could be served that just didn't show up on the map. And so that was what this challenge process was about. So why is the national map important to us here in Wyoming? The national map is important to us here in Wyoming because it is the map that and we'll talk about this in a second, one of the programs we're talking about, the BEAD program, that the federal agency that's administering the BEAD program will use this FCC national broadband map to determine funding allocations to each of the states for broadband infrastructure. So the number of unserved, the number of underserved, if you remember those terminologies, that will all appear on this national map. And we'll be looking at this national map to do, again, some long-term planning for Wyoming under these federal programs. So any questions on the maps? Any discussion? Again, towards the end, we can have a more free-flowing, but just want to make sure that I kind of discuss these state and federal maps quickly, but I think you'll see their role come up in a minute here. Okay. All right. Well, we used these maps to do some number crunching for different regions. Now, I have a whole bunch of regional files here, and I'm not quite sure, because we did these meetings last week sort of region by region, if I was on I met some of you in the southern part of the state. We went through Sweetwater and Carbon and then Laramie and Cheyenne, and we kind of marched through the southern part of the state. So I pulled the slides up only relevant to the southwest and the southeast part of the state. But we did look at business council regions, and we did some number crunching for each of the business council regions about numbers of unserved and underserved. We don't have time today to sort of march through each of the regions. Maybe it's most important for you all to know that we have that data. The slides will be posted as we kind of gather all the information from last week's meetings we'll be making sure that that information is publicly available. But what I will go through a little bit, because I found in the meetings last week what was super helpful, and so I'll just use Northwest since it's the first on my list here as an example. We'll go through a couple of the more geographically granular analyses that we did. But for each of the regions, we looked at three things. We looked at availability of service at that 25-3 level. We looked at federal subsidy use for affordability criteria, and we looked at broadband adoption within that business council region. So these stats are rolled up within a business council region. And so for Northwest Wyoming, a business council region, we found that per the FCC map, and this was actually the number crunching we did an analysis was, I think we just missed, I mentioned that the FCC issued a kind of a formal version 2 of the map a few weeks ago. I think we did this just before some of those updates were made public. So it may look a little different if you go on the map today. But we found that 15% of households in the northwest part of Wyoming are unserved, meaning 15% of the area have 15% of the locations in that region do not have access to 25-3 service or higher. Now, what we wanted to show you all is you may be curious about how the Northwest region of Wyoming is doing relative to the rest of the state. And, you know, the answer is not too bad. What we found was that 17% of the state of Wyoming, of the locations in the state of Wyoming, do not have access to 25-3. So these households are unserved with broadband. And so then the next logical question is, well, how is that compared to the rest of the country? Now, again, once you start to get these sort of, more and more regions, the average or, these stats start to become a little less meaningful, at least in my opinion. But what the FCC map says is that 7% of the country does not have access to broadband at 25-3 or above. Now, that 7%, of course, includes New York City, it includes Los Angeles, and and it includes Rawlins, Wyoming, and it includes fill in your small town across the country. So that data is a little odd, but we do have to look at that in light of looking at the federal map for funding allocation. So it's a relevant stat, but really, we did this across each of the business council regions. For federal subsidy use, we'll talk in a minute about the Affordable Connectivity Program. The FCC has a program that many of you may be aware of that's called the Affordable Connectivity Program. It's a subsidy-based program that gives low-income consumers discounted access to broadband service through their service provider. So the service provider has to be the participant in the program. But what we found is that 18% of eligible households in the Northwest region of Wyoming were currently participating in the Affordable Connectivity Program. So that means that, there's almost 80% of eligible households in the region that have not yet signed up for that program. Now, how are you doing relative to the state? Well, you're about the same. We found that 17% of eligible households in Wyoming have not participated in that program. How are you doing relative to the rest of the country? In the rest of the country, it's 30% of eligible households have signed up for that program. So almost 70% of eligible households in the country have not signed up. That's not terribly surprising. Those of us that have worked in this space for a long time, and I'm sure the ISPs on the phone know, it's not an easy program to sign up for. It's not an easy program to qualify for. And so we do generally see relatively low participation rates. And one of the planning goals for this process is to understand why, what that feedback is, and how to improve these participation rates in ACP. Finally, broadband adoption. This is actually based on census data. So you may not realize that the census actually does ask households whether they have subscribed to a broadband service. Now, their definition is very broad, and really we're just going to call it internet access service. But we found that, and again, maybe this is a surprise, but 63% of households in the northwest part of Wyoming subscribe to some kind of internet access service. Again, in a much broader definition. and 68% of the state's households do, and we have 75%, which may be actually somewhat surprisingly low if we look at the entire country. Only 75% of households in the country say that they subscribe to some kind of internet access service that is not on your phone. That's an important, while census data is broad, as you can see, the definition is from a fiber, cable, or DSL, digital subscriber line provider. So this is not mobile on your phone based, but still, these are the numbers. What we then did, because you all may be thinking, we certainly got feedback during our meetings last week that you could say, well, wait a minute, the Northwest region of Wyoming, and we certainly heard this in the Southeast region meeting in Rawlins that said, whoa, wait a minute. We are being included in the same region as Laramie and Cheyenne, and Rawlins is very different. And we said, yes, we understand that. We want to break down these numbers as sort of granularly as possible. And so we did an analysis by census block group. So what you see here is the Northwest region of Wyoming being broken down by census block group. These delineations of census block group don't change, right? Many of you, especially some of you in economic development, may be very familiar with these census block groups, or if you do any census data crunching for non-broadband related regions, that's what these are. And we looked at the FCC map and we said, okay, which regions are unserved, meaning they have access to less than 25.3 megabit per second service in the Northwest region broken down by census block group. As you can see, the very Northwest part of the state has more than 80% of their locations do not have access to 25.3. It gets a little better as you move sort of away and start to go east, kind of right in that middle section. The lightest color is the lowest number of unserved locations, meaning they're the highest served area. They have the most access to the fastest speeds. The very middle is kind of in the middle, 41 to 60% do not have access, locations do not have access to 25.3. And then that very bottom corner is again fairly high on the unserved locations. They're at the 61 to 80%. So hopefully, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Northwest Wyoming. If you want to shout out right now whether you think this corroborates what your experience is in Northwest Wyoming. I personally was not a feet on the ground person at that meeting, so I don't know if they got that feedback already. I'm sure they did. But we'd love to hear whether this, so you kind of look at this and you're like, it actually looks about right. We have some work to do in the very far northwest corner of the state. So if no one wants to weigh in at this point, be thinking if you guys have any experience in this part of the state. So I'm gonna scroll through these slides fairly quickly. This is actually, again, Northwest. We also did this for locations that do not have 120 megabits per second. If you recall, that's that underserved category. We found these slides to be a little hard to talk through because they're sort of the opposite of the 25.3. And so we found that if you see that top left-hand corner, again, the very far northwest part of the state, they actually now they're the lightest color. They're low. They're 0 to 20% underserved. That kind of makes sense in the sense that very few people have anything above 25.3. And so this was only sort of that criteria between 25.3 and 120. So what you can see is maybe like this middle part of the region, they're not unserved, but many more parts of the region are underserved. They still don't have something beyond 25.3. I mean, sorry, 120. So hopefully that makes some sense. But again, in quiet time, we'll have some of these slides available after we post everything, and you can go through some of these slides. Okay, and so again, I'm just going to scroll through here. I could have hidden some of these. I wasn't sure if we could identify where everybody was from. I was going to kind of focus on a particular region. But because we do have quite a few people on the phone, yay, we don't have time necessarily to go through each of the regions. But, you know, I will stop briefly. You can take a look if you're in the Northeast region. You can see that darker blue is the heavily unserved area of the state of that region. That was at least what the FCC map is showing. Again, in West Central, you can see actually there's not that much dark blue. And again, maybe you can nod your head and say, yeah, from what I know of West Central Wyoming, that is true. We actually don't have a ton of very unserved. And actually here, this is showing that, let's see, how does this work? The middle part is actually 0 to 20%, sorry, 21 to 40% don't have anything above 120. So even in this fairly well-served area of West Central Wyoming, there's not a lot of service being offered above 120 is sort of what this map is showing. East Central, again, here too, not a lot of dark blue. That shows that there's not a lot of less than 25.3. And yet only 0 to 20% of the entire region has access to anything above 120 is basically how I'm reading this, these stats. Then this was where I was, Southwest Wyoming last week. And as you can see, there's a big chunk. This is Riverside and East Encampment, as I learned. Rock Springs isn't, I think Rock Springs is actually a little farther east than that big blue swath, but that big blue swath we drove through between Rock Springs and Rollins, and we found the data shows that it's a very unserved, over 81% do not have access to 25.3 even. And people who were in these meetings looked at that and said, yeah, that's about right. Even Evanston, we did have a meeting in Evanston in the very bottom corner here, and that is very unserved. And again, the folks in the Evanston meeting looked at this and said, yeah, that sounds about right. And then here, a lot of the region does not have access. You know, only 0 to 20% have access to anything above 120. And then Southeast Wyoming is again not terribly unserved by 25.3. But this is again Laramie and Cheyenne, and so I was, you know, told that little chunk, that little round chunk down, kind of right smack dab in the middle of the region is Laramie, and then as you go over farther east, Cheyenne, that shows where areas have access that are not, that areas have access and they're not highly unserved. But yet here again, not a lot over 120. All right, so those are our regional number crunching. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to see if anybody has any questions. Maybe would love to hear if people, you know, have a sense right now of whether the area that they work in doesn't have any access to broadband, what your experience, feet on the ground, maybe working with small businesses, working with different community organizations, constituents in your town, if you know, kind of what the experience is. Do people routinely complain that they don't have the bandwidth, the internet access services that they need to do their daily jobs and daily day-to-day stuff? Would be great to hear. Any hands raised? Not yet. Anything in the chat? Or feel free to put some stuff in the chat. I do want to encourage you guys to use the chat. That would be great. And I would call on people, but I can't quite see everybody. So you're lucky. Okay. Well, we will move on. We'll talk about the funding opportunities, and then we'll have time at the end to do sort of a broader Q&A. Funding and programmatic opportunities. So in Wyoming, we are primarily looking at 3 upcoming Wyoming funding opportunities. We have Connect Wyoming 2, CPF, which stands for Capital Projects Fund. That is a pot of money that came from the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. ARPA was a few years ago, Congress got together to do some COVID emergency funding across the country. You may be familiar with the state and local fiscal recovery funds. That's another pot of money that came under ARPA. Wyoming received a bunch of money under that too. That state and local fiscal recovery fund money could be used for a wide variety of projects that could be used to pay emergency workers, essential workers. It could have been used to do more COVID testing, or it could have been used to do some economic development projects. But the Capital Projects Fund, which is another pot of money, was sort of the uses of that funding was narrower and primarily focused on broadband related projects. One eligible use of that funding was last mile infrastructure deployment. Again, Congress. Pandemic. Oh yeah, we do need to invest more in broadband. We do need to set some money aside to make sure that everybody in the United States has access to what is now an essential service to be able to do things from home. So we're going to set aside this pot of money. So that's Capital Projects Fund. Now, Wyoming, for this Wyoming 2 has about $70 million of Capital Projects Fund money that is going to dedicate to a last mile investment project. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they estimate that that funding will cover about 11,000 households in Wyoming of unserved and underserved households in Wyoming to bring them up to that 100 megabit per second. There are materials on the Wyoming Business Council website already about Connect Wyoming 2. The grant window has not opened yet, but we were talking about the state Wyoming map and the grant application tool. Those are two things that you can go on the map you can go on right now and look and see if you're an ISP, or even if you're a community, you want to look and see where in my community would I like to see broadband investment. And you can start to think about maybe talking to the ISPs that serve your community to see about whether they're planning on applying for funding under Connect Wyoming 2. Now, this is Connect Wyoming 2 because Wyoming also used ARPA funding a couple of years ago to do Connect Wyoming 1. That was about $56 million in funding to do a last mile broadband grant program. Some of you on the phone may have been involved in that process, may have received funding for projects under Connect Wyoming 1. I find this to be very interesting. I think it's very telling. Under Connect Wyoming 1, they had about $56 million, and they announced that ended up funding projects that will eventually serve about 15,000 households in Wyoming. And I just said a minute ago, if you notice, that $70 million is going to serve 11,000 households in Wyoming, thereabout. It's just sort of back of the envelope estimates as we're doing our planning. Why? How is that? How is it that so much more money is going to fund fewer households? And this is something to keep in mind, and the ISPs probably have a sense of this across all of these funding programs. We need to look at the unserved, those dark blue areas on those maps that we just scrolled through. And one reason why they're unserved today is because they are hard to serve. They are expensive. They are in rural areas. They are in geographically difficult areas to get to. So they can be expensive to serve. And so as we create the opportunity to serve more and more households, we're going to be looking at those unserved areas that are harder and harder and more expensive to serve. And so it is only natural that it is going to take more funding to serve fewer households as we go along. So as we connect this community, okay, great, they're done. Now we're going to go farther out and connect an even harder community to connect. It's just going to get more and more expensive to serve. And so that's why this mapping and prioritization and forward planning becomes so important, because these broadband investment dollars are precious, and we have to make sure that we have the funding we need to serve these very high cost areas. So that is Connect Wyoming 2. again, material on the Business Council website. A grant window not quite open yet, but it will be first of these three programs, first to come online. The BEAD program, Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. This is through the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The IIJA set aside about $65 billion worth of broadband funding, 42 billion or so of which is for this BEAD program, which is a last mile infrastructure grant program. We will talk about this in a minute, a little bit more detail about BEAD, but this is yet another one of these funding pots that is for last mile funding. It will be trailing behind the Connect Wyoming 2 and will look a little different, certainly, because it is a very different source of funding. The National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, will be is administering this BEAD program nationwide. And the Business Council is Wyoming, the State of Wyoming's designated agency to administer this funding for Wyoming. Then we have the Statewide Digital Access Plan or Statewide Digital Access Fund or Program. This is a broader program designed to serve different kinds of digital equity or digital access. If you look at the statute, they call it digital equity planning or program. In Wyoming, we want it to be a little bit more inclusive, a little bit broader. We want to call it digital access. You'll see that in a minute. To talk about how to get households online, not just to build the infrastructure, but everything else that goes along with it. And so that will be part of this statewide digital access plan. So these are the three funding opportunities over the next couple of years. You'll see our timeline that we're talking about. So here's our BEAD program. Our BEAD program is Wyoming Business Council's plan for expanding broadband to in-state addresses that will include funds from BEAD. As you see, this is, we're calling this at least $100 million. So we know that Wyoming will receive $100 million in funding for eligible last mile broadband infrastructure programs. Now we say at least because the statute said every state gets at least $100 million. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at our broadband mapping exercises. And this is where the FCC's national map comes in. We're going to look at our broadband mapping exercises. We're going to look at some other criteria, some other data. We're going to crunch these numbers, and we are going to decide how much additional funding on top of the $100 million each state will receive for its BEAD allocation to do last mile infrastructure projects. So we don't know what that number is yet. We don't know how much total money Wyoming will receive for its BEAD funding, except to say that we know it's at least 100 million. And the number will be crunched sort of based on the number of unserved locations in the state, the number of underserved locations in the state, and as I said, a couple of other data elements that then a number will pop out. So what will Wyoming do with that funding? Wyoming will create a last mile broadband infrastructure grant program. It will look a little different than its Connect Wyoming 2 because NTIA has written some rules that Wyoming has to follow. And one of the rules that Wyoming has to follow is that it needs to prioritize its funding. As I mentioned, these very unserved locations in the state, those that cannot get internet service of at least 25.3, those dark blue areas, need to be prioritized under the NTIA federal program rules. So Wyoming is going to create a grant program that says, okay, ISPs and communities who want to partner, communities who want to apply for this funding, we want to see grant proposals that fund unserved locations in Wyoming, that build out to those unserved locations. And then as long as we can demonstrate to the NTIA that we have enough proposals to serve our unserved, we can then create funding or distribute funding to serve the underserved locations, those between 25.3 and 120. And then, oh, by the way, if we have funding left over after that, we can create a grant program or have priority in our grant program that will allow community anchor institutions who may already be served, who may currently be getting above 120, but we can also do some funding to create infrastructure that will serve these community anchor institutions at 1 gigabit per second. faster speeds. We can go well beyond that 100 symmetrical and get these community anchor institutions faster speeds so they can do their mission. They can be a library, a school, community anchor institution that's maybe providing the food bank services or whatever it might be. We can give them 1 gig so they can do their mission and serve the community. And then if there's money left over after that, we can make sure that we'll entertain proposals that are also going to fund low income and affordable housing units, buildings, communities with faster speeds beyond that 100. However, it really does have to be in this order, at least right now under the rules that we're seeing from NTIA and how NTIA wants us to do our planning and provide some information to them. They want to see how we're going to serve these communities in this order. As we're doing the number crunching in light of the number of unserved and at least underserved locations in the state, we're expecting that the allocation that Wyoming will receive from the BEAD program will hopefully get us to be able to do projects in unserved and underserved locations. We may only be the statewide map to determine that piece of it. Just a little bit more on BEAD, which is that the planning and the planning process, you see this timeline down here, and I see I'm getting a message. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. I'm getting a message that maybe my connection's a little unstable, so hopefully I don't disappear on you. That the planning process is taking place right now in 2023. Wyoming did receive about $5 million of its $100 million to do planning. And that's what we're doing here. That's what we did last week. We're doing a lot of in-person meetings, a lot of outreach, a lot of number crunching, a lot of mapping. And we are having to submit a plan. In fact, I'll move down here. We're having to submit a 5-year action plan to NTIA in August. That is the first deliverable that Wyoming Business Council has as part of its BEAD program. And that 5-year action plan will have all the data we're receiving from these meetings, the mapping, the number crunching to tell NTIA what we think is happening today in Wyoming, where we think the gaps are, where we want to spend our dollars, where we're prioritizing things. And then after we submit the 5-year action plan, and even actually right now while we're working on the 5-year action plan, we're also working on something called the initial proposal. That is a document that is the second deliverable that Wyoming has to give the NTIA to design a grant program. How are we making sure that those unserved areas are going to be served and all of the goals and requirements that the NTIA and Congress has given for this funding? How are we making sure that that's going to be satisfied? What is our grant? What is our proposal for what the grant plan is going to look like? That is due at the end of 2023 to NTIA. We envision some back and forth with NTIA at that point to get the proposal and the grant plan just right. And then we anticipate that there will be a program that is funded by BEAD funds, probably second quarter, maybe, hopefully. That's what we're shooting for in 2024. It's getting a little far out there, but that's the timeline we're working under. And as you can see, that will release at least 20% of the allocated funds. Once NTIA approves Wyoming's initial proposal, they'll get 20% of the funds, whatever that number turns out to be, to do this grant program through 2024. After we get that under our belts, the initial grant program, that making sure we've got something that's going to serve all those unserved, maybe bleed a little bit into the underserved areas, we will submit more documentation and data to NTIA that says, hey, we know what we're doing. Hey, everything worked great. That is the final proposal we submit to NTIA. This is our plan going forward. We expect this to be in 2025 sometime. And at that point, NTIA will release the rest of the 80% of the funds. One major milestone I didn't talk about, and it's after the initial proposal is submitted, sort of right in that first quarter, second quarter of 2024, Wyoming Business Council will will release publicly a list of areas of the state that it will prioritize for funding. NTAA wants to see that. They want to see the Wyoming Business Council release that to the public in Wyoming so the public can review it and challenge it. So there will be kind of a challenge process. Wyoming may give it a catchy name, we don't know yet, in sort of early 2024 to let people comment on what Wyoming Business Council believes the data shows is priority areas of the state for funding. So this is the BEAD program. I will stop here. I want to see if folks have comments about where we're at, maybe any questions about the deliverables that Wyoming Business Council is going to have to create and provide. Happy to see if anybody wants to weigh in, particularly on.
Christine, we did have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we did have a little conversation in the chat. Just want to bring your attention to that, just about coverage areas.
Okay,
so
Y. Rest stops. Okay, so yeah, let me see. So yeah, Rollins, Sinclair, Saratoga, that's where I was last week. But yet the areas around it, I mentioned Encampment, Riverside. We had a great woman whose husband is the mayor. Maybe you guys would remember. She owns what she jokes as the biggest small business in Riverside. At our meeting last week, and she's very frustrated by the lack of service in that area. And so hopefully that sort of dark blue area that we showed on the map earlier, we included Riverside and Encampment and some of these towns that you're talking about here as being very unserved. And we are hoping and we're expecting that the mapping will show the need for build out, even though it will be expensive, and we recognize that it'll be expensive. And there's lots to be discussed, lots to be determined about what that build out will look like. But I'm kind of guessing based on the mapping that we'll find that these areas will certainly, if they remain unserved as we look at our initial proposal and the documentation we have to send to NTIA. If they remain unserved, they will be on that list. So hopefully, and not just the Y. Rest stops and the pullouts, which, if that's along the 80 and along some of the major highways in that area, hopefully some of that is served today. If not, that's maybe even something for the Capital Projects Fund program to be looking at. But to really get out into some of these areas and provide reliable service is something that Wyoming Business Council will be looking at. And it's great to hear that Dixon and Bags, we talked about Bags too. I think that's in that same area, maybe, if I'm not mistaken. It says Dixon and Bags have fiber to the home and that Range provides it, which is great. We got some feedback in our in-person meetings that Bags, maybe from a community anchor institution and like the library branches, the schools struggle still a little bit with connection, but I'd love to hear from folks like Jason, if if this is the case, that's great. That we'll certainly note that. We'll take a look and see if the numbers demonstrate that. We got some feedback that maybe it depends on where you are during our in-person meeting discussion. Anybody else? Would love to hear either from Jason or Leslie if you have more to add. Sounds like you guys are definitely experiencing this.
Yeah. Well, this is Leslie. When I mentioned like pullouts or rest stops, I was thinking kind of like in the snowy range area as well as Battle Pass. We do have a little bit of coverage up there for cell phones, but I know that we struggle with emergencies. People know kind of where to go to get access, but not really, if that makes sense. So one of my ideas
varies if depending on the weather and everything else.
Yeah, if we could get even any kind of emergency access at those vault toilet places, that would be awesome for our visitors and our residents alike.
Okay.
emergencies come to everybody. So yeah.
Yeah, public safety is critical. And I guess if anybody else wants to weigh in a little bit specifically on public safety, I know we've got about 15 more minutes, I think, here on the call. So I want to make sure to talk a little bit about digital equity and the digital access, the broader term digital access in the surveys. But if folks have comments on public safety, would love to, hear about it, any anecdotes, any parts of the state or any functions that you all have experienced about public safety. Again, feel free to put it in the chat. And the surveys too, we can talk a little bit about where sort of public safety issues might come in. But okay, why don't I talk a little bit about the digital access program, and then we'll talk about the surveys and the outreach. So digital access funding, this is a separate pot of money. This is what the statute calls digital equity program. But again, I think Wyoming wanted to be a little bit broader and talk about what is digital access. Digital access really incorporates 5 different elements. The Wyoming Business Council is going to do some planning and is starting to do planning and is as part of its BEAD planning, and then also separately for this digital access plan it has to create to make sure that Wyoming residents have broadband access, but not just access like the wires are in the ground, as we were talking about the BEAD program, but access when it comes to affordability and reliability. So, making sure that the services that are being provided to the end user from the wires that are in the ground, the fiber that's in the ground, to make sure that those services are affordable and that they are reliable. So that's what we're looking at when it comes to digital access more broadly. So maybe they've got affordable service, but they don't have an affordable device or a device that works to take advantage of those services. So access to devices is another element of the digital access program that we're looking for funding, potential funding projects, plus tech support. You may have a device, but the minute something goes wrong, does it turn into a brick that you put in your junk drawer? Or do you have access to somebody or an organization or a service that can help you troubleshoot and figure out what's wrong with that device so you can keep using it? Digital literacy and skills sort of combines a lot of these elements of digital access. Do you have the skills to get online and do what you need to do? Do you know how to navigate? Do you know how to install something, how to troubleshoot something? So we're looking at programs that provide digital literacy and skills. Accessible and inclusive content is not that Wyoming Business Council is going to start making videos anytime soon, but making sure that that there is enough education about what is online, that people are motivated to go online. They have in-language services. They have content that's relevant to them. And then privacy and security. Can people go online and feel comfortable? They're not scared to go online. They've heard all these horror stories about the scams and having their identity stolen and having things, and they want to make sure they can protect themselves. So are we making sure that there are trainings out there are programs out there, that the infrastructure is being built in such a way that people can be confident to go online? So all of these elements for the Wyoming Business Council are considered to be under the umbrella of digital access. And so the planning that they're doing, and the plan is due in October, this plan is due in October, will incorporate any of these elements. So the folks from the museum, I know we spoke actually to somebody from the museum last week too, the programs that you're already doing, any of the libraries, any of the schools, these are things you're probably already doing, and we want to hear about those programs. We want to understand what's happening today to serve Wyoming in these fields. And then we have what's called covered populations. We're not only looking at these 5 elements of digital access, but we're looking at them with a particular emphasis on some of these populations and communities that have unique barriers to getting online. And so I'm sure you will recognize your constituents, the folks that you serve, to what their what their unique barriers are. And if you notice, one of the covered populations is just rural residents. If you live in an area that's very high cost, you live in an area that's hard to get to, you are already a covered population under NTIA's sort of terminology. And that's helpful because that will help Wyoming be able to say to NTIA, one of our priorities is to make sure that we're serving all of our rural communities with these programs. So that is the digital access plan. What will happen is that Wyoming will submit a digital access plan in October, and they will then wait for the NTIA to release a state digital equity capacity grant program in 2024, and then open another program in 2025 that will be the funding for these programs. So through these meetings, we'll get feedback from you all about programs that are happening today. And we will then submit our plan to NTIA in October, and then NTIA will release funding to Wyoming in 2024 for Wyoming to create a grant program around those kinds of activities and programs. So hopefully that makes sense. This is the timeline we're looking at. We've talked a little bit about each of these. So the digital access and planning is what we just talked about. 2024 will be the grant funding, our planning right now in 2023. Infrastructure planning, our planning right now in 2023, and the initial proposal due at the end of 2023. The final proposal, I actually think, will be out closer to the beginning of 2025. But the BEAD grant program execution is sort of those last two lines, 4 and 5. And as you see, that is mostly 2024, 2025, and then the building and the deployment of that funding out farther. All right, so we have 10 minutes. I want to talk about the surveys, the partner surveys and inventories that we do have posted. We are actually trying to wrap these up. We released these surveys and posted them on the Wyoming Business Council about a month ago when we did our virtual statewide sessions. We talked about them last week at all of our meetings. So maybe some of the folks in your organizations are already familiar with these surveys. Maybe you've even filled them out. But this is how we gather data from you in addition to these meetings. There are links that we will put in the chat for this meeting, and that again are on the Wyoming Business Council broadband page that you can go on, and there's 6 surveys. Some of you may, like those of you who represent state and local governments, maybe this may be where you fit yourself, and you may want to tell us about assets that you have. We heard the gentleman from the infrastructure provider for the electric utility say, hey, I've got some assets here. So we want to hear about those assets, especially if you're state and local government, whether you already have dark fiber, do you have rooftops, do you have businesses and government buildings that you may be able to put assets on? Have you already done some broadband planning? We want to hear about that from you in these surveys, or put it in the chat right here. Actually, we'd love to hear about whether you have current assets that you think would be helpful for the Wyoming Business Council and its planning processes. Workforce development is actually also another element to this state and local government asset inventory. I'm going to skip around a little bit. The ISP survey here, it says workforce preparedness. The survey is actually broader than that. It is asking about your workforce efforts. What do you have to train your workers? What do you have to hire the right workers? What do you have partners that you work with in the community and in the state to make sure you're getting the right people? We want to hear about that, but we also want to hear about whether you participate in ACP, whether you have partners in the community for things like digital access programs, digital literacy. We want to hear about your disaster recovery approach, your planning, whether you're involved in reliability planning. And so that's the ISP survey. We have a specific survey for workforce because it is such an important element of what the Wyoming Business Council needs to consider. Who is going to be building all of these projects? How can we use these projects to enhance both workforce and economic development? So we're looking at that, and we want to know what's happening today. And then the 3 surveys, the community anchor connectivity, the digital access program, and the barriers and obstacles, they all ask different questions. And really any of you from the introductions we made this morning, any of you on the phone could probably go to any of these and have something to say about the connectivity that community anchor institutions use themselves to do their jobs and their work and what they need. That's the anchor connectivity survey. Programs, as I was saying earlier, that they're currently offering around digital literacy and skills, device loaning, affordability programs, and then barriers and obstacles. What has been your observation, particularly for those covered populations, for people to get online? So those are the surveys. We have a list of discussion questions that kind of are broken out. Our main discussion question slide was about what does connectivity look like for you? What are the current barriers for people to get online that you've observed in your day-to-day work? What programs, opportunities exist today? Assets that you may have. So I know we only have a couple minutes. Hopefully I was, leaving some opportunity for people to weigh in as we went along. I see there's actually fair number of back and forth.
Christine, I linked all of the surveys in the chat for folks and tried to kind of characterize each one. And so you're welcome, as Christine said, to fill out any of those that best represent your organization. But all 6 surveys are linked in the chat. And then I'll also put a link up to the Wyoming Business Council page that has a great write-up of each survey that you can reference after this meeting if needed.
And I'll note Mike Schober's comments about the lack of cellular coverage. What we didn't talk about today very much was wireless, wireline. I tried to shorten this presentation as best as I could. And so one thing that we do emphasize is that for these last mile funding opportunities, fixed wireless is an option. It is an eligible application for funding for a lot of these programs. We recognize that sometimes fiber, while prioritized and while important and relevant, valuable, may not always be the right application. And so to the extent that Wyoming Business Council is considering projects of fixed wireless, we need to understand why fixed wireless is right, but it is on our radar screen. What we've not talked much about is cellular coverage and mobile coverage. From a public safety perspective, I know that a lot of them do rely on sort of the radio transmission and mobile coverage still today. We want to hear about that. We want to understand where that is the case. And we want to understand where people rely on their mobile phones for internet access. I know we had feedback from public housing at a couple meetings that a lot of their constituents, a lot of their residents do solely rely on their wireless phone and their cellular carrier for broadband access at home, at least. But that's why we're funding these projects, is to try to make sure that residents have access to a more reliable form of broadband access. And so we're not talking about, just to clarify here, mobile phone coverage. A lot of mobile carriers are in the fixed wireless business, so they may be applicable here. They may be eligible for funding for those kinds of projects, but not for your end user phone. So hopefully I answered that, or kind of looked at that, but we do want to hear about public safety and the applications that you're currently relying on, so we understand that. Anything else?
I'm not
All right.
seeing anything else in the chat.
Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for getting on the phone. To us, it really means that, you were bummed that you missed our meetings and that you wanted to take this opportunity to hear what was happening. I do hope this was informative and you sort of have a context of where we're at. And we are happy, happy to follow up. If you've got follow-up questions, please do check out the Wyoming Business Council page. I guess I can, we did have one last slide, which is the connect with us slide here. Elena was gracious enough to put her personal contact information on here, but the Business Council website also has a couple of other email addresses that you can use. So thank you again so much for attending.
Thank you.